Hello, welcome to Fireside Chats. My name is Magela Pillai, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you today Sister Denise, who has been practicing Rajyoga Meditation for over 4 decades. Today's subject is a very interesting one entitled Circular Thinking. This show revolves around spirituality. We look at what makes a human being tick, why things upset and hurt people, and how we can cure ourselves from traumas of the past, from things that have been bugging us that we need not necessarily have articulated to anyone else. In this show, we also ask you, the viewer, to look at your relationship with God and ask yourself whether you are satisfied with your relationship with God, or would you like to take it to a deeper level. Sister Denise, a very warm welcome to today's show.
Thank you.
Circular thinking, a very curious topic. Tell us why this is of interest to you.
Well, the other kind of thinking is linear thinking. So linear thinking is when you start somewhere and you go in a straight line somewhere. And what happens with linear thinking is you're accumulating more and more information, and it sort of multiplies. And so what happens with linear thinking is you have to specialize. And so you specialize to a point where you can no longer make contact with the whole of your subject. And so this is really a problem that happens, for example, say in medicine. There's so much information that a medical practitioner can accumulate that they can't hold all of it. And then they become so specialized that their way of handling a particular health issue doesn't take into consideration the whole person. And now you have other approaches which say that if you do that, there is damage because the whole person is the one who's sick. There may be a symptom somewhere, and the practitioner focuses on that symptom, but there's no connection with the root, no connection with the whole person. And a similar thing happens in spirituality, that when you want to understand yourself, you can't really approach it in that way because there's so little knowledge available about a self. Nobody even knows whether there even is a self, you see. So there's just lots and lots of speculation which can take you far, far away and never really get anywhere. So circular thinking is another kind of thinking process altogether, which seems to lend itself very, very well to spirituality, and even perhaps might lend itself well to a number of things that are happening in the human world, but not necessarily in the world of technology, which is where the linear thinking is very prevalent. So circular thinking is like this, that you start somewhere, anywhere, and you want to follow the line of thought about that thing, and you move until you have completed the thought about that thing, and it brings you back to your point of departure. So say, for example, your life. Your life starts with your birth, and then you go through going forward and forward and forward, and at the end of your life comes your death. Well, you don't know what's after that, and you don't know what's before your birth. So because you're looking at life as starting at birth and ending at death, you have a straight line. But if you would know what happened before birth, and if you would know what happens after death, you would keep going, and you would find, when you take into consideration the idea that a soul comes into a body, lives through that life, leaves a body takes another one, lives through that life, takes another one. How far does it go? That's the question. And what happens with circular thinking is you discover that there are cycles within cycles within cycles within cycles, and that the cycle of a soul returns to its point of departure in the process of 5,000 years. So it's a 5,000-year cycle. The life cycle of a mosquito may be 24 hours. The life cycle of a human body may be 70, 80, 90 years. The life cycle of, a table, maybe, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, but everything has a complete time when it gets destroyed. And then from a material point of view, those elements return back to the earth, and somewhere later down the line they reform themselves into other things. So the physical object is something that comes in the straight line, start and finish. What happened before, you're not concerned. What happened afterwards, you're not concerned. It arises, it persists, it disappears. But when you're looking at something like a being, something like a soul, the soul retains its individuality throughout the entire cycle, and it is an indestructible thing, or we could say being. But the important thing is that it's indestructible as an individual thing. Matter is said to be indestructible in a general way, but material objects are absolutely perishable. But a soul remains that. It doesn't turn into something else. So it maintains its individuality throughout time. So anything that you want to think about that has to do with the human soul, you can only really work with that thinking if you apply circular thinking, because you can only really find out what are the changes that it passes through. You cannot really say, why does it exist? Or why does it pass through changes like that? So it's a kind of phenomenology.
Now, Sister Denise, did you teach yourself this, or does it come naturally? And that's the first question. The second I have is, how does one make the transition from being a linear thinker, which most people are, to somebody who thinks like this? It must be hard, because you've got to not change what you're thinking, you've got to change how you're thinking.
So it's a huge thing, really. And I think different people handle it in different ways. But in my case, I was spending a lot of time, even since very early childhood, trying to figure out exactly how long is eternity. Couldn't do it. I would think about some of the things that were taught to me in my religious context, and people would say, okay, at the end of the world, all the people are going to come out of their graves. So I thought, I thought of all the graves in the different cemeteries. Then I thought of the catacombs. And then I thought, there's been people for a very long time, and maybe their graves are lost, people in New Orleans, when there's a big hurricane, well, their graves, they get taken away, they get eaten by fishes. I don't know how this is going to work. So I just used to say, well, it's not practical, it's not realistic. Why do they say that? Is there some other interpretation that we can put on this? Then I used to think, how is it possible for things to be predicted? Because science will say, well, they're random. And then there are other approaches which say, there will be such and such a thing. So can you know in advance? If you can know in advance, I mean, is there such a thing as predestination? And so when you start thinking like that, you have in your mind, or at least I had in my mind, various ways of thinking. And in my education was always about the arts, literature. And so there are rules of aesthetics, but they're subtle. And how do you evaluate, a poem, a piece of literature, a painting? How do you know whether something's great, whether something's good? So I started to be aware that there are a lot of different ways of thinking about things. I remember one time I was very shocked. I was about 7 years old, and the teacher at my school asked the class, in which direction does the moon rise? And everybody said, oh, we don't know about the moon, we only know about the sun. And I thought, oh my God, they never pay attention to the moon. Something wrong here. And so I began to realize that I was actually very in tune with nature. And, nature is full of cycles. There's the cycle of the seasons, there's the cycle of, the different flowers will occur in different colors through the season. So I'm very, very aware of these. And I started to be sensitive to the spiritual end of things, just from a kind of magical sort of a way, as a very small child. So in your education, you have your science, you have your technology, you have your arts, you have your different feelings, you have the whole question of suffering, you have the question of whether or not there's God. There's so many things which kind of coexist, but they're, in a sense, mutually exclusive in terms of how they're set up. So when I started to investigate the Brahmakumaris spirituality, and they're starting to talk about eternity, which I was very interested in terms of a repeating cycle. The symbol for infinity is the 8, the figure 8 lying on its side, and that already is a continuously rotating or repeating cycle. Then you have the yin-yang symbol, and you have, some of the things that come out of China which talk about cycles. And so when I was put in front of this idea and started to think, you see, because when you're put in front of different ideas, you have to evaluate them. Is this feasible? Is this realistic? Does this fit? Does this suit? Is this true? And it's really in trying to figure out these things that I discovered that there is linear thinking and there is circular thinking, and you can do one or the other depending on what kind of thing you want to think about.
Okay. So Denise, if one wants to include God in this mode of thinking, mode of mental functioning, how do you do that? Because is God not point, and how does circular thinking help you understand the divine? Does it have any relevance as far as God is concerned?
Yes, I think it does. You see, God is, first of all, non-human, so doesn't operate like a human. And God is non-changing. So then you see, you have God in a changeless, genderless, all-knowing, all-powerful state, which is absolutely different from the state that we're in. We have gender, we are within time, we're young to old, we don't know what's before, what's after. We are caught up in this world of time and space, and then when you learn about what we call the three worlds, the world of matter, where there is sound, where there is action, where everything is moving around within these natural cycles that you have on the planet, the cycle of water, all these things. Even our body has got the blood cycling around all the time. And then the opposite. So you have two contrasting things. And then, okay, the angle that God has on the world is it's going round and round. And the souls come, they go around, they come back. So there's this kind of cosmic rhythm which God then is an observer of. And you kind of look at that, you know, when you're trying to understand about eternity, it also brings on the question in your mind, what is perpetual motion and why are people trying to find perpetual motion? Because they are. And where do you find perpetual motion is in the cycle of souls coming into the world, going through their full cycle of reincarnation, returning, getting completely restored and re-empowered through their connection with God, and then going through that cycle again. So you can start to see this movement. Now, most people say, what's the point? And I always say, you know, well, you are the point. It's about you. And you need to know, I mean, if you're an eternal soul, what do you do all that time? It's a long time. Mm-hmm. There's no end. Mm. There's no beginning. Mm. So you have to think, okay, there never ever was a time when I didn't exist as me. That's a big one. Mm. How do I wrap my mind around that? There's never going to be a time when as me I cease to exist. So then I have to think, okay, there is no death. I have to leave this body, but there is no death. There's no end. There's no beginning. And you start to be able to think about eternity, but you can't think about it as a very, very long line. Because however long the line is, it's got an end and a beginning. It's still linear, you see. But if you have identically repeating circles, moving between the material world, the non-material world, losing power, gaining power, the whole thing, the whole machinery of it, I thought, yeah, this is the key to perpetual motion. It's probably not something that a human scientist could take possession of, but at least we could understand it and understand how we are within that machinery. And then you start to think, okay, now, what is the value of me? How do I calculate my value? Is everyone of equal value? Are we all equal? Are we not equal? You know, you really want to know the answers to these questions. And when you start to apply this process of circular thinking, where you're looking at everything from every angle, coming through full circle, looking at it again, it gives you insight and clarity, which I find very satisfying. So I like circular thinking, but I know that most people don't find it relevant.
You actually bring me to my next question. So Denise, as I'm listening to you, I'm reminded of that, I think it's the last few lines of Rudyard Kipling's If. It's a poem that he wrote to his son. He said, if you can think but not make thinking your aim. Your aim. Remember? It was a almost like a caveat. Okay, yes. There are certain people who enjoy thinking, like you do. And I must say, whatever you said so far is extremely interesting and thought-provoking. For people who are practical, who think a little and do more, and who lead successful lives, how are you able to implement that which you just said into the real world? Because we live on the outside the ordinary life. So even if you live and lead an extraordinary life, we still have to come out of our heads and put all of this into practice. From what I've heard, from what you've said in the past, nothing that you said is theory. Everything that you state is has a practical aspect to it. So my question is, how are you able to bring what you said into this world and into your life so that you can use it in your relationships with people, in your relationship with matter, with nature, and how you live and breathe?
Yeah, I think that there's a number of approaches that we learn in Raj Yoga, which I find very interesting. And there are practices that we are taught, because you have to be able to, in a sense, stretch yourself so that you can have one foot in the day-to-day world and the other foot in a cosmic sense of the universe, that you can come into relationship, you can move beyond relationships. So it's really about creating this big stretching between the theoretical and the real, the possible and the actual, and bringing everything so that it you come to terms with things that normally people think was just either or. But it's, I think, to do with being able to lift yourself off the mundane whenever you want and be able to enter the mundane, but you're not limited by the mundane, you're not distressed by the mundane, you don't feel that you are deprived if your world is very simple and limited and you don't have lots of money, lots of things or whatever, because you can fill yourself with other things which are very stimulating intellectually and in terms of your mind, the subtleties of that, and you can just go from, great to simple, to ordinary, to extraordinary, to, the spiritual, to the simple duties, enjoy, let go. It really gives you a vast horizon, I suppose.
Mm. Okay, so your reality is divided between what you experience where you do not need your body, your spiritual world, and this world.
Well, we're living in this world, and then people say, okay, now what is the purpose of life? So obviously the purpose of life is to be happy. And then what makes you happy? Well, different people have different things that make them happy. To me, the thing that I figure makes me the most happy is when I understand something I didn't understand before. Because the experience, the inner experience, especially when it has to do with spiritual truth or something like this, it takes you into a sense of the awe and wonder of the universe and beyond the universe. Somehow to be able to get your mind around that and take sustenance from it, it takes you off of the simple and the mundane, and it fills you with some substance that allows you to be very happy with very simple things.
Okay, Sister Denise, unfortunately, we have to bring this circle to a close. So thank you so much for sharing your words of wisdom. You have given the audience food for thought. Definitely food for thought. So there you have it, the subject of circular thinking. This is not something that falls into the vocabulary of most people, but Sister Denise has shared not just what we think is important, but how we think. And she has shared on this as well as previous episodes that we need to actually teach ourselves to think in such a way that we're not harming ourselves in any way. And while one lives in this world, you have to conduct your daily life as you normally do, but to do so with a spiritual understanding and to introduce the divine into your life will only serve you and not harm you in any way. So I hope you've received this message. It was a very powerful one from a yogi who has 4 decades of spiritual knowledge and experience behind her. So thank you so much, Sister Denise, and thank you at home for joining us. Goodbye.